Picture this. On a steaming coastline in Panama, a ragged line of men in tartan collapses behind a half-finished wooden fort. Their lips are cracked, uniforms hanging off fever-thin bodies, and the jungle hums with mosquitoes. Inside the camp, a bell tolls again. Another burial. 10, 12 people a day now. They've called this place New Edinburgh. They've named the bay Caledonia. They've been told they are the vanguard of a glorious Scottish empire. But as they lower yet another body into the wet red soil, every man here knows the truth. This is not a promised land. It is a graveyard. What almost none of them know is the scale of the gamble that sent them here. Back home, this sweltering patch of jungle represents something unbelievable. Roughly a quarter of everything Scotland owns in ready money. The savings of nobles and shopkeepers, town councils and widows. Imagine an entire nation pouring 25% of its liquid wealth into a single all-or-nothing startup, then sending 2,000 of its people to test the idea in one of the most lethal disease zones on Earth. In less than 18 months, the experiment will implode. The colony will vanish. Almost every ship will be lost. The money will be gone. And the shock will be so deep it helps push Scotland into political union with its richer neighbor England. A whole country effectively bought out by a bailout. This is the story of the Darien Scheme, the investment that killed a nation. By the 1690s, Scotland was in trouble. Harvests failed again and again. Oat fields blackened in the cold. In some parishes, people survived on grass and whatever animals they could catch. 1 in 6 Scots lived by begging. In some regions, 2/3 of the population simply disappeared, dead or emigrated. At the same time, King William's continental wars demanded money. Taxes rose. English and European tariffs shut Scottish merchants out of lucrative markets. While London boomed on colonial profits, the ports of Leith and Glasgow felt like dead ends. It wasn't just poverty, it was humiliation. Scotland watched as English companies carved the world into zones of profit and power. The East India Company guarded its monopolies with lawyers and guns. Scots were told, in effect, you are too small, you are too late, there's nothing left for you. Into this despair stepped William Paterson. Born in Dumfriesshire, he had traded in the West Indies and helped found the Bank of England. He understood money, empire, and crucially, geography. Paterson's obsession was a narrow waste of land in Central America, the Isthmus of Darien in today's Panama. Stand there, he said, and you are at the doors of the seas, a short walk between the Atlantic and Pacific. Why sail the deadly months around Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope when goods could cross a strip of land? Imagine a Scottish outpost at that choke point. Ships from Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas all funneled through Scottish hands. A toll here, a tax there. A tiny kingdom turned global middleman. For a country starving for both food and dignity, the idea was electrifying. This wasn't just profit. It was proof Scotland could stand alongside England, Spain, and Holland as an imperial power. In 1695, the Scottish Parliament created the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. Paterson planned to raise $600,000, half in Scotland, half from investors in London and Europe. At first, money flowed from England. Then the East India Company noticed. To them, this Scottish startup wasn't a plucky underdog. It was a rival. They leaned on Parliament and King William. Lawsuits were threatened. English investors were warned, pull out or risk ruin. One by one, the foreign backers vanished. In a normal world, that would have killed the scheme. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Scottish anger hardened into defiance. If the English and Dutch wouldn't stand with them, then Scotland would go it alone. In a matter of weeks in 1696, the Company of Scotland raised $400,000 entirely from within Scotland. That sum equaled roughly a quarter of all liquid wealth in the kingdom, more than double the value of Scotland's annual exports. Some estimates push it closer to 40% of available capital. And it didn't just come from dukes and bankers. Noble families mortgaged estates, merchants and ministers subscribed. Over 1,000 ordinary investors appeared on the books with small stakes, 5 here, 10 there. Town councils dipped into common good funds meant to protect their poorest citizens. Widows put in everything they had. This wasn't just buying shares, it was buying a future. The company's Latin motto captured the mood. Where the world is opened up, its strength, being united, becomes stronger. Most people never saw a map of Panama. Many couldn't have pointed to Darien on a globe. What they knew was this: England had its empire, Holland had its empire, Spain had half the world. Now at last, Scotland had a shot. Miss this, and they would be left on the sidelines forever. FOMO, 17th century style. So when, in July 1698, 5 ships finally slipped out of Leith Harbor, with around 1,200 colonists aboard, Scotland watched with pride and fear. Everyone had skin in the game. The journey took months. When the Scottish fleet finally dropped anchor off Darien in November, the first impressions almost matched the dream. A deep, sheltered bay, fresh water from the hills, lush greenery. They named the harbor Caledonia and began building Fort St. Andrew on a low promontory. They hacked out a clearing for New Edinburgh and tried planting maize and yams. They raised the Scottish flag. On paper, it still looked like destiny. In reality, 3 lethal problems appeared almost immediately. First, the ground itself. The jungle was dense, the soil swampy, the air heavy. Rain hammered down for days. Anything made of iron or fabric rusted and rotted. Much of the food packed in Scotland had spoiled in the tropical humidity. Flour turned sour. Meat stank. Barrels leaked. There was no serious reserve. Second, the human environment. The local Kuna were wary but not hostile. They simply had little interest in what the Scots were offering. Trinkets and cheap cloth meant less than tools and weapons the colonists couldn't spare. Trade limped along. And third, the killer no one truly understood: disease. Darien sat in a hyper-endemic zone for malaria and yellow fever. The Scots arrived with no immunity, no quinine, and no idea that mosquitoes carried their killers. They built huts low and airless, right where mosquitoes thrived. By March 1699, only a few months after landing, the bell in New Edinburgh tolled constantly. 10 people, sometimes 12, died every day. Fever, chills, black vomit, bloody dysentery. Men staggered into the jungle and didn't return. Graves multiplied until the colony seemed ringed by its own dead. Meanwhile, the story reaching investors sounded very different. Letters that spoke plainly of hunger and disease were rarely printed. Instead, carefully chosen reports appeared as pamphlets and newsletters. These described rich soils, healthy settlers, promising trade. Edinburgh coffee houses buzzed with good news. On the ground, reality tightened like a noose. Desperate, the colonists sent ships to nearby English colonies for help. Jamaica, Barbados, North America, anywhere that might sell them food. But King William, under pressure from English merchants, had issued a brutal order. No English colony was to trade with the Scots at Darien. Dutch merchants were warned off as well. Captains who wanted to help risked fines and worse. The Scottish ships came back almost empty. One, the Dolphin, never came back at all. It was seized by the Spanish and its crew imprisoned. Inside the colony, leadership fractured. The 7-man council bickered and blamed. Some wanted to abandon the site. Others clung to Patterson's vision and insisted they hold on. By June 1699, starvation and disease made the choice for them. The survivors, skeletal, many barely able to stand, spiked their guns, burned what they couldn't carry, and crowded onto the remaining ships. Fort St. Andrew and New Edinburgh were left to the jungle. They sailed away from Darien, leaving behind shallow graves and a handful of rotting structures. Here's the cruel twist. As those ships limped toward home, another Scottish fleet was already on its way in the opposite direction. Encouraged by glowing, outdated letters, the Company of Scotland had dispatched a second expedition, 4 more ships loaded with settlers and supplies, to reinforce what they thought was a struggling but survivable colony. In July 1699, that second fleet rounded the headland into Caledonia Bay. They expected smoke from chimneys, men on the shore, a gun salute from Fort St. Andrew. They found silence. Empty huts sagging in the rain, abandoned tools, graves in the grass. New Edinburgh was a ghost town. The rational move was clear: evacuate and cut the losses. Instead, pride and sunk-cost hope took over. These new leaders chose to rebuild. They repaired the fort, replanted crops, and wrote upbeat letters home. Few wanted to imagine returning to Scotland as the men who had finally killed the national dream. The second attempt went no better. Disease ripped through the new settlers with the same merciless speed. Over the next 18 months, more than 70% of them would die. This time, another power moved decisively: Spain. Spain claimed Central America by right of earlier conquest. They had not heavily settled the Darien coast, but they would not tolerate a new European rival there. Spanish authorities in Cartagena and Portobello watched the Scottish experiments with alarm. When news of the rebuilding reached them, along with whispers of Scottish dealings with local tribes, concern turned into action. Scottish leaders, hearing rumors of impending Spanish attack, made a fateful choice. They would strike first. In January 1700, a small Scottish force marched through the jungle and attacked the Spanish fort at Tubacanti. Against the odds, they won. For a moment, men at Darien tasted real triumph. They'd beaten Spain's soldiers on their own ground. But the victory was disastrous. Instead of scaring Spain away, it provoked a full-scale response. Governor-General Pimiento organized a fleet and army to crush the settlement once and for all. In March 1700, Spanish ships appeared off Caledonia Bay, and troops landed to tighten a siege around Fort St. Andrew. Inside the fort, the Scots faced blockade, bombardment, and the same old enemies: malaria, yellow fever, hunger. Their numbers were already wrecked by disease. Now cut off by sea and land, there was no way out. Still, they held on for weeks. When the Scottish commander finally agreed to terms, it wasn't after some heroic last-stand charge. It was with men barely strong enough to walk to the negotiation table. The Spanish allowed them to leave. The surviving colonists, those who could still climb a gangplank, filed onto their ships and sailed away from Darien for the last time. Of the original fleets that had left Scotland, only one ship would ever see Leith again. Out of roughly 2,000 settlers who dreamed of empire, most now lay in unmarked graves along the steamy coast. The colonists paid with their lives. Back in Scotland, investors were about to learn what they had paid with. When the truth finally broke through the spin and delay, it hit like a storm. The Darien Scheme had failed completely. The colony was gone. The ships were gone. Around 400,000, perhaps a quarter of Scotland's capital, had evaporated. And 2,000 sons, husbands, and fathers would not be coming home. Rage erupted. Crowds filled the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow. Pamphlets denounced traitors and fools. Surviving colonists, many scarred for life by disease, were not hailed as heroes. They were shunned, accused of cowardice or corruption. William Patterson, who had lost his own wife and child to disease at Darien, came back ruined in mind and money. His reputation never truly recovered. Ordinary families who had sunk their savings into company shares now faced ruin. Towns that had invested their common good funds struggled to support the very poor those funds were meant to protect. The young Bank of Scotland staggered under the shock. In coffee houses and kirks, people asked the burning questions. Was this catastrophe simply Scottish incompetence? Bad planning, bad provisioning, deadly naivety about tropical disease? Or had England deliberately strangled the venture? Evidence fueled both sides. On one hand, the facts of the expedition. The site was unhealthy. Supplies were inadequate and badly stored. Leadership fractured. No one had seriously planned for disease. On the other, English behavior. King William's embargo had starved the colony of trade. English investors had been forced out by East India Company pressure. English colonies that could have easily saved the Scots with food and medicine had turned them away. To many, especially those who had lost everything, the conclusion was obvious. England had sabotaged Darien to crush Scottish competition. Decades later, Robert Burns would capture the feeling in one furious line: "We're bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in a nation." Whether you see conspiracy or tragic clash of interests, one fact is clear. The Darien disaster left Scotland economically broken and politically shaken. The dream of going it alone, of matching England ship for ship and colony for colony, lay smashed on a tropical shore. And in London, politicians saw their chance. For years, English rulers had pushed for a closer political union with Scotland. A unified island would be easier to defend, easier to tax, easier to control. But the Scots had clung to their independent parliament. After Darien, the equation changed. Scotland's elites were deeply in debt. Many had been major Darien investors whose fortunes disappeared with the colony. The economy was fragile. The future looked grim. England applied pressure. In 1705, the English Parliament passed the Alien Act. Unless Scotland accepted England's chosen royal succession or entered serious union talks, Scots in England would be treated as aliens. More dangerously, Scottish exports of cattle, coal, and linen to England would be cut off. For a battered economy, that was an existential threat. Negotiations followed. The key bargaining chip was money. If Scotland joined a United Kingdom, sharing a parliament and a monarch, should it also share England's massive national debt? Scottish negotiators argued they shouldn't be forced to shoulder an English burden when they were already crushed by their own disaster. The compromise was called, with dry irony, the equivalent. England would pay Scotland a lump sum, 398,085 and 10 shillings, to compensate for taking on a share of English debts and to smooth the economic shock of union. On paper, it was a technical adjustment. In practice, everyone knew what it was: a bailout. More than half of that money, about 59%, went straight to Darien shareholders and creditors. The men and institutions who had staked fortunes on New Caledonia were now being reimbursed by England for their losses. The rest funded various public uses and, notoriously, encouraged key Scottish parliamentarians to support union. Large quiet payments went to leading nobles. Whether you call those compensation or bribes depends on your politics. The result was undeniable. In 1707, the Act of Union passed. The Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh voted itself out of existence. From then on, Scotland and England would be governed by a single parliament in London. The Darien Scheme, launched to make Scotland an independent imperial power, had ended by helping erase that independence. The company's grand office in Edinburgh, where so many had once queued to buy shares, became an administrative center for managing the equivalent payout. Over time, the body that handled that money evolved, merged, and in 1727 received a royal charter as a bank. Its name? The Royal Bank of Scotland. One of the world's major financial institutions, traces its roots directly to the ruins of Darien. So what does this saga leave us with? You can see familiar patterns: a desperate country locked out of booming markets, a seductive shortcut promising to leapfrog the competition, a wave of national FOMO, glowing reports drowning out bad news, and, in the background, bigger powers quietly pulling levers. The Darien colonists carried muskets instead of smartphones, but the psychology feels modern. It's the logic of bubbles and manias, of once-in-a-lifetime opportunities that seem too important to miss. There's also the sting of information control. As the colony sickened, investors read about success. Reality and narrative drifted apart, until they snapped back together in one brutal shock. And finally, there is identity. Before Darien, Scotland imagined itself as a separate kingdom that might still build its own empire. After Darien, that confidence cracked, and union came on terms shaped by trauma and debt. Stand today on that overgrown bay where the jungle has swallowed the last traces of New Edinburgh, and it's hard to picture the marching drums and bright flags. What remains is a quieter image, a small country convinced it must risk everything to avoid being left behind, and learning too late that some bets can cost more than money. They can cost a nation its future.